Hi everyone, welcome back to the Foundations in Pre-Calculus 10 videos. In this video, we're going to look at Lesson 5 from Chapter 3, which is, once again, talking about polynomials. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at factoring trinomials, which is essentially the opposite process of the FOIL process that we learned in the last video. So when factoring a trinomial in the form x squared plus bx plus c, we use the process that I like to call the product sum method. This is also called factoring. And as I said, this is the opposite process of FOILing. So when we FOILed, we looked at two binomials that were multiplying each other, and we were able to create a trinomial based off of that. So say, for example, we had x minus 2 times x plus 1 to come up with the trinomial x squared minus x minus 2. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to be looking at this trinomial, and we're going to try and break it down into its factors or into two binomial terms. So now there are three steps to the product sum method or to factoring, and I'll just quickly read over them, and we'll go a little bit slower and a little bit more in depth in our actual example. So the first step when we're factoring or using the product sum method is that we're going to write the middle term, which is this term with just the x. So we're going to write this in two different terms. And we're not just going to rewrite it just using any kind of method that we want. We're going to pick out specific ways to rewrite this using a little process. So to rewrite it, we must find two numbers that multiply to get to your c value, which is this constant right here. But it must add to your b value, so this -1. So it must multiply to -2, but add to get -1. So then when we find those numbers, we're going to rewrite this b term, so that way there's two different terms using those two numbers that multiply to -2 and add to -1. Then what we're going to do is we're going to group the first two terms together and pull out a common factor, and then group the last two terms and pull out a common factor. If we do all of our work correctly, what we should notice is that we get the exact same binomial left over when we pull out that common factor. And then our last step is we're going to pull out that common factor, so that resulting binomial that's exactly the same. And then what we're left with is something that looks like this, where we have two binomials multiplying each other. So as I said, we're going to take this a little bit more step by step, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense when we do our example. And this one here is number 1 from your notes. So here we're going to factor the trinomial x squared minus 8x plus 7. So according to our steps, our first one said to rewrite the middle term. So to rewrite the middle term, you need to look at a number that multiplies to the c term. So it has a product of +7 and adds or has a sum of -8. This is where I call it the product sum method. So you want to think of two numbers that multiply to 7 but have a sum of -8. And there's some tricks to this. When you see that you have a positive product, it means that both numbers either have to be both positive or both negative. Then to figure out which one is which, you move over to this negative sum, which tells you that both numbers have to be negative. So both numbers have to multiply to 7, which would be 1 and 7. We also know that they have to be negative because they have a negative sum, so we're tack on those negatives. So therefore, our two numbers are -1 and -7. Now we're going to rewrite this middle term using the coefficients -1 and -7. So the first term stays exactly the same, so we have x squared. Then we'll separate this with a minus 1x, or we can just write minus x, and then minus 7x, and bring down this third term, which is plus 7. So notice how we said the word rewrite. If we were to go back and simplify this by combining our like terms, we'd have -x minus 7x. That would bring us right back to -8x. So we rewrote it And we basically just made it look different, but it's essentially saying the same thing. But what this does is that this breaks it up into 4 different terms, where we can put the first 2 terms into a box, and then the last 2 terms into a box. Then we're going to look at look for a common factor that's in common with your first box of terms. So we have x squared and negative x. So what's in common here is an x, so we're going to pull that out. And what we're left with is x squared divided by x is just x. And we have negative x divided by x is just negative 1. This is from our first set. Then we want to do is, then we're going to look at our second set. So we have negative 7x plus 7. Now what we're going to do here is we know that we see a 7 in common with negative 7x and positive 7. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that these 2 brackets, our binomials left over, look exactly the same. So we're also going to remove this negative 7, or this negative symbol as well. So I'm going to pull it a negative 7. So I'm going to separate it with a negative symbol. If it were positive, you'd separate it with a plus sign instead. Then you're going to write whatever you're left with. So then negative 7x divided by negative 7 is just x. And then 7 divided by negative 7 is negative 1. So what you notice here is that your binomials here, what's left over after you've pulled out a common factor, is exactly the same. That's how you know you did your work right. So then ultimately what we have is we actually are only left with 2 terms here. When they're multiplying here, this means that this is 1 term. So you have 1 term and then a second term. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pull out a common factor of x minus 1 from those 2 terms. So pull out an x minus 1. Essentially what you're left with is x on the left side. Pull out an x minus 1 and you're left with minus 7. So here we have the resulting x minus 1 times x minus 7. So if we want to check our work, all we'd have to do is just basically go backwards, where you guys could FOIL and see that you guys would get this resulting trinomial. And one last thing to note before we finish off the video here is that you might have a slightly different answer than what you might see in, say, your textbook, or if you're comparing answers with your friends. And what I mean is that maybe some people might have x minus 7 times x minus 1. So if you guys had your 2 brackets switched, that's okay, because that's telling you the exact same thing. Because what happens in this process is, what if they put the negative 7 first instead of the negative 1? So as long as you have what's inside of your brackets is exactly the same, maybe they're just out of order, that's okay. It just means that you might have switched 2 numbers when you're trying to figure out your product and sum. But if you guys are ever unsure, just come and see me, and I can hopefully help clarify any questions you guys might have. So that is everything here for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys have any questions, make sure to come see me in class or text me on Remind 101.